Hi, I'm Jess from Prototype, and it is now 1 year since Jen's short story collection, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, came out in the first week of lockdown really coming into play. It's been the strangest year to have a debut collection out, but we've had amazing support, and I couldn't be happier with the way the book's gone. But to mark the first year, we thought we would have a little conversation about the book, and reflect a bit on what this year's been like. So to start with, I thought I'd ask a question to see if we can summarize what this book is, just in a few short sentences.
I mean, it's very, very tricky, but firstly, it's a collection of stories that I wrote over a long period of time. So I think it's quite difficult to summarize the book because it's got a range of different, themes and questions. But I think fundamentally it's looking at power dynamics and myth making, identity, inherited modes of living, and how that can create crisis in people's lives. Among other things.
So the stories were written over a number of years, but I think there's a sense of coherence, and the stories feel like they've been put together for a reason. I know when we started off, there were a few stories that we were deciding whether or not they should stay in, and we took a few out. I realised that was my suggestion rather than yours, so there may have been some things that I kind of engineered and perhaps shouldn't have. But how do you think that there is a kind of unifying idea, or kind of, what makes the collection feel coherent in the way that it does, I think?
Well, I think, like when you were saying about the stories getting taken out, I very much remember it being the right thing to do, because I think at that moment when I sent you all the stories, and then I also sent you, a couple of additional stories, I think it was a good call because they were stylistically different or tonally different. They just didn't fit, and I think you get to a point where someone needs to tell you that they don't fit. Whereas right at the beginning you're like, oh, it should be as many stories as possible, and rather than the best stories that fit together, that it's not about quantity, it's about quality and coherence. I think they might. I was watching a talk with that Lydia Davis was giving, and someone asked her the exact same question about, why does it feel like all her stories cohere in her collections? And her answer was, well, because I wrote them. And I think part of me feels that is the same answer for me, that although I fear that I don't have, that there's no such thing maybe yet as a Jen Calleja story. Maybe there is, and maybe that's why they fit together. I think maybe I'm looking at things in the same way in all the stories, and maybe I go so far into things in the same way, in the same levels, and I think it's difficult as the writer to maybe see that coherence.
No, it's definitely there, and maybe it's in the voice, although I think the stories do range between quite a lot of there's quite a different mood as you move through the collection. I think maybe, although interestingly there is still this sense of unity and of you having your own distinctive voice, which is maybe what makes it even more exciting to read, that there's both that coherence and the ability to write in so many different styles. One thing that I think is quite strong, and people who've read it will remember this, but there is a kind of sense of the surreal in quite a few of the stories. Is that something that you could talk about a bit, and how that surreal quality comes into your work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I really like writing stories that do have a surreal element, and I think in the stories in the collection, some you could say are very surreal, others there's just like a touch of the surreal or a moment that is surreal that kind of reminds you that it's not real, or that it's not depicting a world exactly like the world that we inhabit. And for me, that comes from feeling that all written stories are not real, you know, that they're all fabricated. And if that's the case, why not enter the strange? And also I feel that the strange and the surreal, I think much like poetry, it's in that use of imagery and otherworldliness and uncanny that you get closer to things.
Yeah.
So it's a way of adding layer and nuance without having to kind of tell the reader these things. So you don't have to tell the reader all the information, because you can actually layer up things within the stories. So yeah.
Perhaps it also makes you understand reality a bit more. I think you kind of, when it's such a subtle difference, you almost question what is and isn't real, and there's familiarity in the surreal, I think, as well.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's connected to this, I think, is that a lot of the stories are extremely funny, often through strangeness. But yeah, how does humour work throughout the collection, do you think? Do you think it works in a similar way, as a kind of taking you out of, it sort of takes you into a different place and gives you a different layer of understanding, I think, alongside some quite serious ideas and themes that are being explored?
Yeah, I think it's such an amazing compliment to be told that some of the stories are funny. And a friend of mine who read the book, he texted me and he was like, I just didn't expect them to be so funny. And I was really surprised, because, you know, often my stories are quite dark, or they're looking at quite dark things. And I think there's different answers. One answer is that I really wanted to challenge myself to try and be funny, because I think I read, say, Ellie Williams's A Trip. What I found amazing about that collection was that it was happy and funny and amazing. And I think I thought maybe it's far more challenging in a way to create something that is funny and that is also looking at quite serious or profound subject matter. There's also this thing that I was constantly thinking about, that you know proper literature doesn't have to be serious, and I think it's this constant thing of, if you're not writing in a serious way, that somehow it's not literature and it's not worthy or profound. So it's also, I think it comes from a challenging of myself to write about something that I really care about, but that I can also write in a funny way. So, like the story The Natural, which is about someone who wants to be a serious actor, I think encapsulates that maybe it's also reflecting me, you know, trying to put off being funny because that character is afraid that it means he's not a good actor.
I think one of the big skills in the collection is that the sense of humor and the style that you write in makes it incredibly readable and accessible. And I think, although in some ways it's quite experimental, it's also incredibly easy to read, and I think that's quite rare. I think that often experimental comes with this label of kind of inaccessibility or being dense or difficult, and no one actually really wants to read it. And this collection is so far from being that. And I think humor and this surreal quality are both really important in creating that, and it's important. And I think the people have loved reading this book because it is a pleasure to read, while also lingering, because of all these ideas that it's looking at. Something else that's important, and this I think relates to you're talking about that story, the natural, in the sense of you coming through the stories. So there's, I think, the idea or characters who are writers or artists of some kind. There's quite a few of them in this collection, often satirical in the way you portray them. Do you think these stories are a reflection of your experiences, working as a writer and translator and kind of navigating the literary world, whatever that is?
Yeah, I think some of it is based on real experience, or real worries and real fantasies that I've had about, say, the publishing industry, but also the kind of art world. Translations very much mixed in with that. And yeah, it is satirical. This was another challenge as well, because I knew that I wanted to write about the kind of machinery behind the arts, because it's something I thought about a lot, but it was really difficult not to, sometimes it would just come across as quite bitter, that I was somehow like a conspiracy theorist talking about how none of it was real and it's all manufactured and stuff. So that was also a challenge to myself, to like write about it in a way that would be entertaining for someone else, that it wasn't just a kind of a tortured diary entry, that it's which I think comes down to having a good character that is living these things, that the reader can then access what I'm talking about with. And there was also this worry, obviously, of, should I be writing about writers and should I be writing about artists, because it seems kind of narcissistic. But at the same time, I think it is really important in a kind of meta way to reflect on being a writer and an artist, and to reflect on a world that I'm very much within, that I know a lot about. It's kind of like write what you know, and it's like I know that those worlds very well. Yeah.
I think those worlds also tell us things about much wider frames of society. They're kind of microcosms of bigger things. Something when you were kind of summarizing the book at the beginning, this idea of power and of gender roles, which I think is very important. There are some stories that are quite explicitly thinking about that. There's also characters that move between different roles. Could you just talk a little bit more about the ideas of power in relation to gender? Mm-hmm. Perhaps not only, but what kind of ideas were you wanting to communicate in the stories, do you think? And I think that's definitely another kind of unifying theme of the collection.
Yeah, so I think again it was thinking about how to navigate really big questions, I think, because obviously gender dynamics and gender roles is such a huge thing. So I think it was tricky trying to find really specific stories where I could explore really massive ideas and quite complicated ideas that I was having about gender. But for instance, the turn, which is quite early on in the story, in the collection, is looking at a woman who is in quite a manipulative relationship, and is kind of constantly pregnant, like she's having many children, and it's almost like that is what her partner is using to control her. And that kind of that was based on something I'd read, like an article about how pregnancy can be used within, say, a domestic violence situation. And I was just obsessed with this idea, and you know, something that is so meant to be so joyful and so empowering, that it could be kind of manipulated in that way. So exploring not only the woman's point of view, but also how the partner had got to this stage, that he had reached this horrible kind of power over somebody that he once kind of loved and respected, because it was important to me that it was trying to chart their whole relationship, that it wasn't kind of something that happened overnight, that happens kind of bit by bit. And then I think the amnesty, which is a kind of gender role reversal, so existing in a world where it's kind of a matriarchal society, but one that that mirrors patriarchal society. And that, for me, it's wasn't meant to be gimmicky. It's more, you know, sometimes you can reveal something that's right in front of your eyes, but only if there is a strange, uncanny switch. So you know, finding these kind of creative parallels for real kind of harassment and again, controlling situations that women experience on a daily basis, but trying to reimagine it in this other world where women are the ones that have the most kind of social power. But not being this absolute switch where it's just women acting like men, but trying to construct a whole world and a whole series of behaviours that are unique to that world, to try and reveal something about our own kind of world.
Yeah. I think the amnesty, I think, is still available online to read, isn't it?
Yes.
If anyone wants to go and have a look. I wondered if we could talk a little bit about your writing processes. Maybe particularly thinking about, I mean, you do so many different things, and work as translator, writing a PhD, and writing short stories, poetry, which is how we first came to work together. What attracted you particularly to the short story form, and what are your writing processes like? There's a great podcast, which was the podcast you talked about the processes of writing and how bus journeys have been so important.
Unsound methods, yeah.
Unsound methods, and that's, of course, the lockdown just took away that kind of space for you. But yeah, could you just talk a little bit about your writing processes?
So for the short story in particular, it's always been my favourite mode of writing, ever since I was really young. And the only reason, I think, I had a poetry collection finished before a short story collection, because we did our book 2016, the poetry came out. I think that was because I'd gone through a bit of a spurt where people kept asking me to write poems for magazines or for online or for anthologies, and I suddenly had more poems and that I could work with to build a collection. Whereas short fiction, I hadn't been asked to write as many stories. I didn't have that as big a collection ready. So really, it has always been kind of my priority that it would be short fiction. And I was really happy when it finally happened. I had enough stories to play with. My process is finding a question and then trying to answer that question through fiction, which sounds quite straightforward. But often the reason is that I'm not really looking for an answer. I'm trying to explode the question and explode the possible answer. So it's not a straight up answer. It's that through the story, I want to complicate the whole thing, explore why I'm asking that question, what kind of answers come instantaneously to that question, how would other people answer that question. So it's trying to have a prismatic response to that question and explore it through imagery and character and situation. And I write very quickly. So I think with a lot of the stories, when you first saw them, they'd only gone through a couple of drafts, but then the more experimental ones, I think those are the ones that I then had to work on a lot more. Because it was through, I think, you reading or other people reading it, realizing that it wasn't tight enough, that I'd made so many assumptions of what the reader could instantly get. So that was really, really useful, because I don't really show my work to anyone else. But then I always find that's the best thing for your work, is someone else reading and saying, I'm like, what are you trying to do here? Because it's not really coming across, or the beginning feels like it should be in the middle. Or,
Do you think that if asked to, you could write a question alongside each of the stories? Do you think that in terms of your process, are those questions still in your memory, or did they kind of morph into more complex hybrid things?
I mean, I think they could all be. I think I probably have forgotten what most of the first questions were, but I think I could translate them all into a question. Maybe other people could as well. I mean, maybe it's a game people can play.
This would be a very good game. Send us your questions.
What do you think the question was? But again, questioning, that again comes across in the amnesty, which is based on questions. So I think that was built up out of me having a game with myself around how would different characters respond to these questions, and then it turned into a story.
Something I realised that I've never asked you, weirdly, is how you chose the title. It was kind of the title from really early on, wasn't it? And it was just really great. But I don't think I've ever asked you how you came to that.
I think it's a connection to my writing process, so the speed. Because of the speed that these stories were made, but also some of them aren't very long. It's kind of like only a couple of them. I was very proud to actually have longish short stories, but also in relation to television and the screen. It's this common thing you hear at the end of television shows and the news and things. So I suppose as well, like how maybe some of the stories don't have conclusions. So it's kind of like, and already you have to move on, and you're still left with questions or left with things that you need to think about.
So before we go, just thinking about the context in which this book came out, which obviously is just completely mad and we could never have foreseen. I remember the last time we saw each other, in fact, was a week or so before the launch. And there was still a kind of vague, probably kind of foolish glimmer of hope that we might be able to do it. But then, it all happened, and kind of before anyone knew how to do Zoom events, and it was just suddenly happened, and that was it. Launch was off. And it was really sad. And I think we did what we could, and it's been amazing to have so much support. I really felt there was a huge amount of support for you and for indie presses, and that's been quite a special thing to have come out of this year. But how did it feel to have your first book that you'd waited excitedly so long for come out in a pandemic where you couldn't sit in a room and celebrate with your friends? And how's that been?
It was rubbish, I think is the word. I think I was really taken aback at how much it hit me, and it probably hit you the same, that because there wasn't any kind of time to psychologically understand that it wasn't happening and what was happening, and it really was like the launch was happening, what was meant to happen, right when everything really kicked off. I think the first week, I think I was really bummed out about it. It kind of really hit me because I think I was really confused. That I thought there was going to be this party. I thought I was going to have a couple of hours to just feel proud about the book, and I was almost like saving up that moment, and then it didn't happen. And in the grand scheme of things, after about a week, I was like, pull yourself together. There's a lot going on that's very serious. But I think ignoring the grand scheme of things and thinking specifically about the book, it was really quite shocking, because it was like a long lead up to creating the book and us working on it together and everything. But what was I going to say? Yeah, and also, like you say, it's like now I think we know what we would have done, because but at that point there was no precedent for say like Zoom launching or like doing Instagram stories readings. It was like that's it. And obviously everyone caught up quite quickly after that, you know, a few months in, everyone had started to get used to it. But by then I was like already really kind of tired and still like really disappointed and confused. And I think it took me almost a full year now to be like, to understand what the last year was like. So it was. I
think we have a lot of making up of things to do. I feel determined that these missed celebrations do need to happen. I think it also makes you realize how important this kind of community and these real life things when it's a very solitary process, writing and publishing when you're on your own, and not having that kind of marker of bringing it out into the world is you really are lacking in something important.
And it was things like I've still never seen it in a bookshop, so it still feels like it's made up in a way. But you were really amazing throughout the whole thing. And
likewise, it was a mad times. Well, I mean, it's memorable, right? Well, we'll always remember that your book came out the week.
It did come out, and like you say as well, people were really amazing and very supportive, and you know, every message I got was just like exceptional and like would really buoy me up for like a whole day or a few days. So you know, it's really, it just had so many conversations with myself about it in terms of like, does it matter? Yes, it matters. Should I feel sad? Should I feel happy? You know, it's just been very difficult.
Finally, through this past year of little to do apart from work, what have you been working on? And do you think that your processes or interests or focus have been changed by the strange circumstances?
I think once I got out of my little hole where I was very unmotivated to do much, I think I've come back with a lot of ideas for different projects, and these are all now on the go. A few months after I'm Afraid That's All We've Got Time For came out, Goblins came out, which was a pamphlet of rough trade books, which I wrote in kind of a big splurge, and then again nothing could really be done for that when that came out, which was a shame, but again it was really wonderful to have that. And now I'm working on a book as part of my PhD, which is like a translation memoir about being a translator, becoming a translator, and that's going to be a super surreal book. It's set in a book/art/fun fair, and the reader gets to go to lots of different booths and stalls and rides and learn more about translation. And I'm editing my first novel, which is quite experimental and is going through a bit of a wrangle, and I'm starting planning/writing a second novel. I think that's everything. And then in the back of my mind's like, maybe another poetry collection would be good, and you know, should I write an essay about this? I think my main problem is I get distracted by a lot of different projects, so I have to try and schedule them to try and take place one after the other. But if you have ideas, I just have to write them down in these dedicated notebooks and try and not have this jumble just going around in my head.
Amazing. Exciting things to look forward to. Thank you, Jen, and let's hope next time that we're doing this in the same room.
Yes. Thanks so much, Jess.